The U.S. and Ukraine have now signed a deal granting America access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals. Now, you may remember that deal could have been signed after that Oval Office blow-up between Presidents Trump and Zelensky back in February. Ukrainian officials say the deal is a 50-50 partnership with no debt obligations for Kyiv. Now, the two sides also agreed to establish a U.S. Ukraine Reconstruction Fund, which the two countries say will inject money into the economy of both countries. President Zelensky released this statement just moments ago saying, quote, "It is truly an equal agreement that creates an opportunity for investments in Ukraine, quite significant ones." Zelensky also touts the modernization of production in Ukraine and the modernization of legal practices in that country as well. Here now is the director of Critical Mineral Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Gracelin Baskaran. Thank you so much for joining us, Gracelin. First, can you talk more about the benefits of a so-called Reconstruction Fund? And even though we know this is going to benefit the economy, is this going to have any impact on a peace agreement? Does this help move the ball forward at all?
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. The Reconstruction Fund is really meant to be an economic recovery vehicle. So essentially what happens, it's co-owned and co-managed by U.S. and Ukraine. Ukraine, however, still manages full ownership and authority over their natural resources. Importantly, though, none of the current minerals, oil, or gas projects that are currently producing will contribute to this fund. However, future projects will put 50% into this fund. And any sort of U.S. military assistance that is provided will account for the U.S. contribution to this fund. So it also unlocks potential for that continued military support. And we saw that President Trump has already approved $50 million of arms sales to Ukraine after the deal was signed. Now, in terms of, the mineral side of things, there's a long runway here because, there's a lot of resources that we have a broad understanding Ukraine has. However, our big difficulty is that the geological survey, the very data of what makes an economic deposit, was done 30 to 60 years ago by the Soviet Union. So the first thing we're going to need to do is a complete mapping to see what is commercially viable to mine.
I go into a little bit more about the actual minerals that we're talking about here. What kind of natural resources does Ukraine have? And moving forward, how is that going to benefit America?
So Ukraine has a number of things. So they have titanium, which is really critical for the defense industry. They have 4 lithium reserves. One of the complexities of those lithium reserves is that 2 of the 4 are actually on Russian occupied land. Graphite. And one of the big things that's come into play are rare earths, which are actually a subset of 17 critical minerals. And, for us in the U.S., rare earths have taken center stage because China imposed export controls on them about a month ago. The difficulty is this, we don't have a modern mapping of these rare earths. Everything from dysprosium and terbium to neodymium and scandium. These are really critical for defense technology, semiconductors, cars. So what we see is a few challenges, like I mentioned earlier, is we have these resources, but we have to build a lot of energy infrastructure. Mining uses about 16% of the world's electricity. A lot of that energy infrastructure has been damaged by the war. Mapping, and then there is a security risk because we don't have that peace deal.
So does this deal moving forward potentially lay the groundwork for expanding trade power for other critical minerals in other countries? Is this sort of a groundbreaking, pun intended, deal that could be a sign of the future?
This military for investment kind of deal is actually it's really in a way a very unique blueprint. And what we're starting to see is it's already happening again. So Democratic Republic of Congo, about a week ago, Rwanda, the DRC, and the United States, brokered here in Washington, signed a kind of a principles agreement for peace because there's been war between Rwanda and the DRC. And now what we're looking to do is to advance that. All 3 governments have said they're hoping to hit a peace deal by May 2nd. And this all came after the Congolese president came to President Trump and said that he needed security support in exchange for minerals. And Congo has some of the best reserves. It's a much more developed mining industry than Ukraine of copper, cobalt, lithium, nickel. So it's starting to create a blueprint for a model where, first of all, minerals is a mainstay of foreign policy, to a more transactional foreign policy where we exchange minerals for essentially investment.
I want to lean into something you said back to Ukraine just a moment ago. Just to be clear, do we know how many mineral resources are in Ukraine? I mean, you mentioned that so much of it has been destroyed by this war. How do we know how much we're going to be essentially developing after all of this?
We have to do a geological mapping first, So, I mean, we know, for example, that there are commercially attractive or commercially viable deposits of lithium, but we don't have. The former director of the Ukrainian Geological Survey has actually come out and said there is no modern mapping of rare earths that exists. So that mapping and that data is going to be critical, because ultimately building a mine and a processing facility costs between $500 million and $1 billion. So before companies can come and make that investment, they need a more recent database.
Yeah, they need to know what they're going to be getting. All right, Gracelin Baskaran, thank you so much.